Okay, thank you, everybody. And for those just joining us, welcome once again to our symposium this morning, which is being held in conjunction with Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization Week at the University of Windsor. I'm Irene Moore Davis from the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, and we're so pleased that you could join us to explore the fluid frontier, slavery resistance, the Underground Railroad, and these Detroit River Borderlands, this Detroit River region. So our first speaker today is Carolyn Smarts-Frost. Carolyn Smarts-Frost was one of the two editors of the volume on which we are concentrating this morning, A Fluid Frontier. Carolyn's bio is as follows. Carolyn Smarts-Frost is an archaeologist, historian, and award-winning author with a doctorate in the history of race, slavery, and imperialism from the University of Waterloo. Carolyn is the Senior Research Fellow for a Black People's History of Canada project at Dalhousie University. In 1985, Carolyn and her team uncovered the first Underground Railroad site dug in Canada. It was the home of Lucy and Thornton Blackburn, freedom seekers from Kentucky, whose recapture in Detroit sparked the Blackburn riots of 1833. Freed to start new lives in Canada, they moved to Toronto and began the city's first cab business. I've Got a Home in Glory Land, A Lost Tale of the Underground Railroad, 2007, Carolyn's biography of the Blackburns, which was the result of 20 years of research, won the coveted Governor General's Literary Award for nonfiction and is one of my favorite works of nonfiction. The Blackburn Project sparked a deep interest in Underground Railroad era operations along the Detroit River. Carolyn is the author or co-editor of 5 acclaimed volumes on African Canadian history. She is especially proud of the award-winning binational collection of essays entitled A Fluid Frontier, Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderland, 2016. Which she co-edited with Vida Smith-Tucker. Now living in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, Carolyn is also an adjunct professor at Acadia and Dalhousie Universities and an affiliated research scholar at the University of Buffalo Archaeology Lab. Her current plans include a children's book on the discovery of the Blackburn site in collaboration with beloved African-Canadian artist Charmaine Lurch. Please welcome Dr. Carolyn Smarts-Frost.
Well, thank you very much, Irene, for the kind invitation. And I want to thank everybody who helped make today possible. It is a wonderful event, and I'm always delighted to speak about the importance of the Detroit River to both Canadian and American heritage and respect the Underground Railroad. And it's wonderful, too, to see so many of you virtually, at least. Today, I've been asked to talk about the volume, A Fluid Frontier, Slavery, Resistance, and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderland, which was published in 2016. I'm only sorry my co-editor, Dr. Vida Smith-Tucker, could not join us today. She was formerly a professor at Michigan's Grand Valley State University and is retired. She's now living in Atlanta. But we forged a remarkable friendship over the production of this book. It took 7 years to put together. I miss her very much, so I wanted to have a shout out to her today. The book was conceived at a meeting called by Kimberly Simmons of Detroit at Fort Wayne in 2009. The book project was first announced in January 2011 at a community partners meeting held at the University of Detroit Mercy, hosted by the Congressman John Conyers and his staff. A Fluid Frontier was inspired by efforts on the part of the remarkable Kimberly Simmons, really. She had in 2008 initiated efforts to have the Detroit River designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Such a designation by UNESCO would recognize the uniquely important role the Detroit River played in transnational efforts to assist formerly enslaved African Americans in reaching freedom in Canada, and once there, in creating the new lives for themselves. As everyone here is aware, the Detroit River has been both a boundary and a transit point for enslaved African Americans seeking freedom since the first European colonization efforts in the district began in the early 18th century. With efforts along the Niagara River that are only now beginning to be recognized, I'm working on that too, the Detroit Frontier served throughout the antebellum period as a major gateway into British North America for thousands of passengers on the Underground Railroad. The Detroit River is the only waterway in North America that carries a dual designation on the part of the two nations. It is designated as an American Heritage River, which happened in 1998, and a Canadian Heritage River, which received that designation in 2001. Now, an application for World Heritage Site designation requires agreement on both the part of the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament. It quickly became apparent that in order to achieve such agreement, those of us committed to the Detroit River Project needed something to show people. While there existed an almost overwhelming amount of evidence regarding anti-slavery and Underground Railroad activism in this area, and a number of excellent articles and even some books illuminated specific aspects of the history, there was no published volume that showcased results of recent research. Well, I've been accused of having helium hand, and Vita has the same problem too. You know what I mean? Your hand goes up automatically in meetings to volunteer for extremely onerous duties. That's what happened in this case. So Vita and I volunteered to do something about the lack of recent literature to support the bid for the UNESCO designation. And the rest is history, as it were. We offered to undertake the editing of a new volume, and The Fluid Frontier was born. The book was envisioned as an exploration of evidence for the ways in which the Detroit River borderland was both a place of passage for thousands of formerly enslaved African Americans and home to remarkable and inspiring efforts on the part of Black people living on the Detroit side and their relatives, friends, and neighbors on the opposite Canadian shore. They joined hands across those broad waters, as it were, developing a most impressive series of well-crafted and very effective resistant mechanisms to further the cause of freedom. We approached the academic and community historians on both sides of the border. We knew everybody, of course. Our purpose was to engage with the newest research based on fresh evidence for Underground Railroad activism. Furthermore, we wanted to apply concepts drawn from a promising theoretical field that could contextualize and illuminate this significant history. And that was the field of Borderland Studies. It was first suggested as an area of research in the early 20th century as a means for studying the lives of people living on either side of the US-Mexican border. But it's since been applied usually to modern circumstances around the world. Most frequently, it is used to assist in understanding the situation in which refugees today find themselves in borderland areas. It's particularly salient at the moment, isn't it? When we first started researching Borderland Studies, we were almost surprised at how much sense it made. It's a pretty simple idea, really, and it makes perfect sense in light of the antebellum experience of people of African descent on the Detroit River shore. To put it most simply, it suggests that people living on either side of a major boundary live and have always lived in a place apart. They have in common climate, economic circumstances, access to resources, and a host of other factors. This is due to the particular geography of the region in which they live. They also have both experience and cultural factors in some ways that are more similar to one another's than they are to their own compatriots living further inland. And as was then and is still very much the case, the Black communities in the Detroit River borderland often shared ties of faith, community, and family. These welded their societies together in a unit despite differences of political governance and even nationality. Then in 2011, Gregory Wigmore wrote an article entitled "Before the Railroad, From Slavery to Freedom in the Canadian-American Borderland." It deals with the Detroit River in the period when slavery still flourished on both sides of the Detroit River. This was quickly followed by a piece by Guillaume Teasdale entitled "Old Friends and New Foes, French Settlers and Indians in the Detroit River Border Region," and that was published in 2012. There are a host of examples of the application of borderland theory to other historical contexts now too, such as those by scholars Randy Wittes, Jay Gitlins, and others. We also drew on the work of transnationalism along the Detroit riverfront by the late great Michigan historian Nora Fairs. Please know that we were very much aware that A Fluid Frontier would be the first published volume to apply borderland theory retrospectively to the Underground Railroad. The Detroit River proved a perfect place to explore the incredibly courageous, well-organized, and very successful efforts undertaken by African Americans and African Canadians in that borderland in freedom's cause. Another departure we planned for the book was not only its thoroughly binational character, there are essays by 7 American and 6 Canadian authors, but also the fact that we approached both academic scholars and community historians. Our reasons are articulated in the book's introduction. We said, several of our authors are university-based scholars whose work is significant in the study of the Underground Railroad in both Michigan and Ontario. However, long before contemporary academics turned their attention to Underground Railroad studies, community historians kept this rich history alive. Often descendants of freedom seekers' families themselves, they preserved oral traditions, carefully protected artifacts, and maintained historical places evocative of this elusive history. They lovingly combed collected documents, photographs, and newspaper accounts that supported memories of time, place, and experience circulating in local communities throughout North America to this day. Academic historians have benefited from community historians' preservation of oral histories and personal narratives, and from their special insights into the meanings of these microhistories. A Fluid Frontier honors the tireless work of community historians and reflects the importance of these narratives. And it also honors, honors the tireless work of community historians, which are foundational to the continuing comparative and analytical research on the Underground Railroad era that engages many academic scholars today. Now, for the preface, we enlisted a chapter by a towering figure in American history of race and the Civil War, and that's Dr. David Blight. He's a native of Flint, Michigan, and started out as a high school teacher there before earning his doctorate. He is now the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. And I know Dr. Blight quite well because part of this book was actually produced while I was the bicentennial visiting professor for Canadian Studies in that very special facility in New Haven, Connecticut. The volume is divided into 5 sections. The papers contained in each presenting a special perspective on the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River region. Much of the information contained in the volume had never been published before, and thus it makes a truly groundbreaking contribution to our understanding of the Detroit River Borderlands' incredibly valuable history of African American and African Canadian resistance. The first section is Crossing Boundaries, the papers in which to explore the Detroit River's earlier colonial history of enslavement. That one, it talks about how the people used the Detroit River to reach freedom, and they crossed in both directions to do so. That chapter is by Vita Smith Tucker. My own dealt with the period between 1810 up to about the 1830s, and it ends with the Blackburn riots of 1833. It is explicitly a transnationalist piece and concludes with a comprehensive and very important, the section concludes with a comprehensive and very important study by Brian Prince of the multiple legal attempts on the part of American slaveholders to have freedom seekers extradited back to the United States. The second section is Communal Voices. This foregrounds the political and social activism of African Americans and African Canadians, areas of research often neglected in the study of the Underground Railroad, which has long been dominated by white savior stories. Here, chapters by Irene Moore Davis, Barbara Hughes Smith, and Adrian Shad detail the history of community and institution building by intersecting and overlapping Black communities on either side of the border, and examine ways in which these facilitated the development of the Underground Railroad networks. The third section, Inspired Transnationalists, contains papers that further our understanding of the freedom seeker experience and explore resistant institutions and ideas. The role played by Henry and Mary Bibb in the creation of the first Black Canadian abolitionist newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive, is articulated by Afua Cooper, and it was from Afua Cooper's brilliant PhD thesis that we borrowed the term A Fluid Frontier. It's really evocative. Roy Finkenbein studied the Colored Vigilant Committee of Detroit and its binational role in making the Underground Railroad operation so effective in the Detroit River Borderlands. And that section concludes with an important chapter by Margaret Washington of Cornell, discussing the role of women working in freedom's cause along the Detroit River, including Marianne Shad, Sojourner Truth, and Laura Haviland. The fourth section is entitled Resilient Families. The chapters by Kimberly Simmons and Larry McClellan, Debbie and Marty, and Carol E. Mull, where Carol's with us here today, articulate the special experience of courageous Black transnationalist families during the Underground Railroad era, the dangers posed by slave catchers and avaricious slaveholders in pursuing their prey as far as the Canadian border with Michigan and sometimes beyond is highlighted, as is the courage of Black people on both sides of that borderline in helping individual families reach freedom, often at great personal risk. The final and fifth section, The Trumpet Sounds, contains Louis DeCaro's landmark article on John Brown and how witnessing slavery firsthand on an early visit to Detroit in about 1812 and helped inspire Brown's lifelong dedication to abolitionism. The article continues to highlight the part played by African Americans in Michigan and African Canadians, particularly in Chatham, in what is now Ontario, in furthering Brown's cause in the period leading up to his raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The volume closes with an extensive bibliographical essay. We put a lot of time into that, but I expect from the content of today's program that we're going to find out how outdated that one we published in 2016 is now in light of recent discoveries. Now, the binational and mixed scholarly and community history nature of our volume posed challenges for us in finding a publisher. Finally, and most enthusiastically, editor Catherine Wildblom, who's now retired from Wayne State University Press, decided to accept our proposal for what would turn out to be a very unusual book. And it is, isn't it? My fellow panelists today, several of whom are contributing authors to our volume, will remember at least some of the arduous process of producing it. No one envisioned that it would take 7 years to put it out, at least of all Vita and myself, although we had the very best cadre of contributing authors that we could possibly imagine. They put up with a lot from us in respect to delays, edits, and urgent requests over the years, and Vita and I ourselves faced multiple challenges. Before we were done, life changes saw me move from Collingwood, Ontario on Georgian Bay to Toronto, to New Haven, Connecticut, and finally to my current home in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Vita's trajectory was equally complex and included her retirement from Grand Valley State, a life-changing trip to Ghana, and her move to Atlanta, where she now resides. In between, we both experienced challenges in health. We experienced the loss of loved ones, and we had a host of personal issues that complicated the completion of our editorial duties. We traveled to each other's homes, wherever they might be at that time. We two editors, we met at Vita's place in Grand Rapids, at my place in Toronto, and we spent time in New Haven together as well at Yale, and we spent a lot of weekends at the Days Inn in Windsor, Ontario. So the volume was published finally in February 2016 to great fanfare on both sides of the border. It has become a staple of Underground Railroad studies, and as recent developments are proving, is achieving the objectives we set for it and more. We're going to hear about all of that today, so I'm not going to preempt my colleagues. I'm just going to say it was all worth it. And through all of that, Vita and I remain good friends, which I think is a bit of a miracle. And I can't think of a better way of closing except to say that we intended this book to do exactly what it's doing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carolyn Smards-Frost, for that wonderful overview of how this came into being and what this book is about. I'd like to now introduce some of the contributors. You've already met me, and you've already met Dr. Carolyn Smards-Frost, of course. Roy Finkenbein is professor of history, co-chair of the history department, and director of the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Detroit Mercy. He teaches courses in African American history, modern Africa, slave resistance, the Civil War era, and the Underground Railroad. He received his doctorate from Bowling Green State University in 1982 and joined the Detroit Mercy faculty in 1996. While on the editorial staff of the Black Abolitionist Papers Project at Florida State University in the 1980s and 1990s, he co-edited the 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers, 1830 to 1865. 1985 to 1992 was when that occurred, and Witness for Freedom, African-American Voices on Race, Slavery, and Emancipation in 1993. He has authored Sources of the African-American Past, the first edition in 1997 and second edition in 2004, as well as over a dozen articles and book chapters related to the Black abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. Finkenbein has consulted on museum exhibits, documentary films, and television programs on aspects of African-American history. His op-eds have appeared in the History News Network, Time, Newsweek, Raw Story, Alternet, and Faithfully magazine. Currently, Finkenbein is completing a book entitled The Indigenous Underground Railroad, Freedom Seekers in Indian Country. He is on the editorial board of the Michigan Historical Review, the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission, the planning team for International Underground Railroad Month, and the advisory board for the Slave Stampedes Project. Please welcome Roy Finkenbein. We have with us Carol Mull. Carol Mull, B.A.M.S., is a historic preservationist and Michigan Underground Railroad scholar. She wrote The Underground Railroad in Michigan in 2010, has published articles, created tours and exhibits, and provided presentations about the Underground Railroad for over a decade. Ms. Mull served as a founding member and chairperson on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. She is the recipient of the Underground Railroad Free Press 2012 Prize for the Advancement of Knowledge. Currently, Ms. Mull serves as the scholar in residence of the Washtenaw County African American Museum. Please welcome Carol Mull. We also have with us Kimberly L. Simmons. Kimberly L. Simmons' background is diverse and has included both for-profit and nonprofit leadership posts. She is an international speaker as evidenced by her membership in the International Speakers Bureau for the U.S. State Department, a researcher, author, and the founding president and executive director of the Detroit River Project, a nonprofit organization with the mission to establish designation of the historic Detroit River as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In January 2022, she convened an international coalition encompassing local and national government entities and organizations on both sides of the Detroit River region's international border to move forward on bi-national initiatives that include the establishment of an international freedom corridor and a K-12 international educational curriculum. Ms. Simmons' program, Caroline Quarles, A Family Legacy of Freedom, was awarded national partner status in 2005 with the U.S. National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, and she is a co-author of the 2019 book To the River with Thorn Creek Press and Ride, Cycle the World through Penguin Random House. Welcome, Kimberly Simmons. And I am so thrilled that this panelist is with us today. Adrian Shad was one of the original contributors to this volume, but was not able to participate in any of our group discussions when it was released. So we are so pleased that Adrian Shad is here now. Adrian Shad is a consultant, curator, and author who has conducted research for plaques, films, and exhibits, including I'll Use My Freedom Well, the exhibit at Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Black Mecca, the story of Chatham's Black community. Most recently, she has collaborated on the Black heritage of the Ward neighborhood for installation at the new courthouse just north of Osgoode Hall in Toronto. She is the author, co-author, and editor of numerous books and articles, including The Journey from Tollgate to Parkway, African Canadians in Hamilton, and the new edition of the Underground Railroad Next Stop Toronto with Afua Cooper and Carolyn Smards Frost. She has also collaborated on the award-winning children's publication, Freedom, as well as Early Civilizations of Africa with Rubicon Publishing. Adrian has been recognized with the William P. Hubbard Award for Race Relations and the J.C. Holland Award for Arts Achievement for her research and writing. She is currently part of the team out of Dalhousie University that is working on a comprehensive education project entitled A Black People's History of Canada. And I'm Irene Moore Davis, president of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. I'm an educator who teaches courses at St. Clair College on the Underground Railroad, race relations, and hip hop culture and social change. I'm also very proud to have been a contributor to this book, and I'm also executive producer of 2 documentaries that you will have seen one of them already, The North Was Our Canaan, which explores Black histories in Sandwich Town, and a new one that will be released in June, Across the River to Freedom, also about Black history in Sandwich Town. So welcome to all of our panelists today. So happy to engage in this discussion with you. I'm going to begin with the question, what was your role in the Fluid Frontier volume? What was your role? And if you contributed a chapter, what were the highlights of that chapter? You can unmute and speak at any time.
I'll jump in first. I contributed the chapter in the Colored Vigilant Committee of Detroit. And one of the things it highlighted for me is, particularly in the last 2 decades of the pre-Civil War era, just how crucial and dominant the role of Black people themselves, both free Blacks and freedom seekers, were to that experience. You mentioned, or Carolyn mentioned, the white savior trope that often appears in Underground Railroad Studies, and I think we smashed that in the volume, and my chapter hopefully did part of that.
Carolyn? Carolyn, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Further to that, because it's directly relevant to what Roy said, his chapter is terrific. In addition to the introduction and the bibliographical essay at the end that Vida and I co-wrote, we each had a chapter in the book, and mine was entitled Forging Transnational Networks for Freedom. And I explored the period between about 1810 and the 1830s, when the Underground Railroad effectively got its name, the 1830s, because of the arrival of steam trains. But what I wanted to mention, in light of what Roy just said about foregrounding African American and African Canadian activism and hearing their voices, in that my own chapter, I addressed my own theory that after the Black communities on both sides of the river who had engaged in the rescue of 2 refugees from Kentucky slavery, Ben and Daniel, who were chased to Michigan by a slave catcher by the name of Ezekiel K. Hudnall, in the winter of 1828 and 1829, I believe that the communities on both sides of the border who were engaged in rescuing those men from a boat that was moored on the Detroit River, directly on the river, I believe the communities actually laid plans for what they would do when this happened again. Because I will tell you that the rescue of Thornton Lucy Blackburn, which is the next major escape case that happened after Ben and Daniel's 1833, right? I believe that was carefully choreographed and planned in advance. That riot was in no way, the Blackburn riots of 1830 were in no way spontaneous. The groundwork was laid for that long in advance. And this agrees with all of the information that we've been able to pull together since on that. So I just wanted to close and say that was, again, foregrounding Black activism, but the planning that went across from both sides of the border that went into making that happen was very important.
Well, since my name has been invoked several times already today, thank you, Carolyn Smarts Frost. I cannot tell you how much every time I do a panel or the book is even mentioned, that we're friends now. All of us, I think, developed quite a friendship over the course of not only the book writing, but everything that's ensued. And I totally appreciate everything that you and Vida did in particular, putting up with all of us and the editing factor. Every time I got one of those emails, I'm like, again? But as Carolyn has mentioned, she mentioned earlier, this volume actually, it's served a lot of purposes over the course of the last 6 years. having been turned into resource material for courses from the University of Michigan, the University of Windsor, and a multitude in between. But I want to thank you personally for this. My part of the book, besides everything that was mentioned by Dr. Frost, actually I wrote a chapter, co-authored a chapter with Larry McClellan, who is a Chicago historian / minister / social activist. I know I'm very fortunate to know quite a few PhDs. I'm not. Larry holds 2. So I don't know what that says about the company that I keep. So that said, my chapter was about my family. I am an Underground Railroad descendant, as a lot of you're going to hear actually from a lot of descendants today. But I am a descendant of the Watkins family in Windsor. The Watkins family is pretty well known in the Windsor Sandwich area. And we've been hanging around since 1835. So my chapter is part of the 4th part of the book, which is Resilient Families. Chapter 10, it's Bridging Rivers, Carolyn Quarles' Remarkable Journey. And it discusses the journey of both of my ancestors, Carolyn Quarles, who became Carolyn Quarles Watkins, who was the first documented escape through the state of Wisconsin. And her soon-to-be husband, his name was Alan Watkins, the patriarch and matriarch of our family. And Alan escaped out of Kentucky in 1835, arrived a little earlier than his wife, with 3 little people under the age of 10 in tow. So I described a journey and a legacy that I tell people now is still evolving. That I think that's a part that maybe we can touch upon a little later on in our discussion. But as long as one of the descendants, as long as descendants live, and you've got quite a few in front of you, long as descendants live, this story lives. There is no end to this history. A lot of people like to put a bookend to the beginning and the end of stories. There is no end. This story hasn't ended yet. So with that, I will allow someone else to speak.
I guess I will jump in now. My chapter was called The McCoys, Charting Freedom from Both Sides of the River. I focused on this one family as an example of the numbers of people that are basically unknown, although we'll talk later about how many more I've uncovered, who returned to Michigan, the other side of the river, before the Civil War. And I also hoped in my chapter to highlight the fact that the borderland extended far beyond Detroit. And I think it's very important when we talk about these borderlands to remember how all of these points along the river were also places where people were helped to cross from the south to north and on the Canada side as well. And so I hoped with my individual stories to have us have more of an overview and maybe learn more in the future. And obviously I already have found many more like that, of how the final decades of the antebellum period allowed people to cross either direction for the best opportunities for themselves, because they had the freedom, the legal freedom in Canada, and that gave them the space to move where they could do their best. Thank you.
Adrian, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Okay, I'd like to thank Irene for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's the very first time, as she mentioned, that I've participated in anything to do with a fluid frontier. And I really appreciate that, being given that opportunity. And I'd like to thank Carolyn and Vita Smith Tucker for inviting me to participate on the volume itself, which has come to be a very celebrated volume. So thank you very much, Carolyn, for that opportunity. My article looked at, well, it gave brief histories of three churches, or well, yeah, three churches, really. The Amherstburg First Baptist Church, the Sandwich Baptist Church, and the First Africa Baptist Church of Colchester. That was, it's known to be, or believed to be, the very first Black Baptist church established in our province of Ontario. And it was believed to be established about 1819, 1820. So I talked about that church as well. However, I think the most important aspect of my article was the history and development of the Amherstburg Baptist Association, now known as the Amherstburg Regular Missionary Baptist Association, and beginning in 1841. And I spent a lot of really joyous days at the Baptist Archives in McMaster University in Hamilton, looking through those old meeting minutes, annual meeting minutes of the ABA, and really learning about all of the important people who were involved in the churches and in the ABA, leaders of the ABA. I also talked about the importance of those churches on the Canadian side to the reception of freedom seekers coming from the United States, their role in receiving them, making sure that they were fed, clothed, housed, helped them get their first jobs. I also talked about some of the schism and divisions that occurred, particularly in the 1850s, when the ABA, or Amherstburg Baptist Association, split, and another umbrella organization was briefly established called the Canadian Anti-Baptist or Anti-Slavery Baptist Association. So those were the main things that I talked about in the article.
And for me, my chapter was about Black Canadian settlements on the Canadian side of the river, of course. And it was such a joy just to be able to put pen to paper and type those keys and make sure that there was a true and accurate reflection of the diversity and complexity and richness and success of these many settlements that formed in Essex County along the Detroit River. There's always been this strange concept that people crossed the finish line to get to freedom in Canada and then just kind of vanished, or that there were just sort of, you know, these very spotty locations where people gathered as people of African descent. But in fact, there were many wonderful settlements. You know, in addition to people populating the towns, there were these wonderful settlements established for and by people of African descent, and great stories of success, stories of triumph, stories of hardship, but also resilience and overcoming. The involvement of so many people in business and skilled trades, so to speak, and not just relying on manual labor, although many people worked very hard at whatever they were doing. The schools that were founded, the churches, the organizations, self-help organizations, mutual aid societies, and so on, and the continued striving and resistance of these individuals who crossed into freedom, along with the free people of African descent with whom they were co-located. The way that people were using petitions and the courts and their own feet to protest racism and injustice in those early years. Those were stories that needed to be told. And while I wish I had had a lot more space and room to tell them, it was great to have that chapter in there and to be part of it. So thank you to Carolyn and Vita for inviting all of us to be part of that volume. My next question is, how has this work, in your opinion, shaped the broader public's understanding of slavery, abolitionism, and the Underground Railroad? Who wants to go? How has this work shaped the broader public's understanding of slavery, abolitionism, and the Underground Railroad, in your opinion?
I'll make a brief comment, and one is as somebody who spent the early part of my life studying the Black abolitionists, I became fairly aware early on of the kind of the East Coast bias in looking at these things, including the Underground Railroad. National studies of the Underground Railroad historically have looked very much at what's going on from Virginia and Maryland northward up that East Coast, and privileging the stories of a David Ruggles, a Harriet Tubman, a Frederick Douglass. And I think one of the things this volume did is really begin to open up awareness beyond our region of just how important the Detroit River Borderland is, particularly in the Midwest in general, in the Underground Railroad story.
Thank you.
I will follow what Roy just said. It still amazes me in 2022 how often during presentations, and I do presentations, as was mentioned earlier, for the State Department. So I'm speaking to people in England, Pakistan, but it still amazes me that in 2022, the first name, and she will appear on the $20 bill eventually, but is Harriet Tubman. And you know, it's got to the point where I'd say, you know, if Harriet was the only person involved in this history, this story, she would have been a very tired woman. But it has allowed, this volume has allowed people to understand, and in particular here in this place, the Detroit River region, which is where I think many are calling in from. It has allowed people in this river region to understand their importance, because I do not think that we yet have grasped the idea that we are as important as a region in the middle of not only this story, the story of the Underground Railroad, but the story of freedom and resistance in general in the world. We are huge. And I get an opportunity a little later on in this symposium to expand on that. But I still find it really interesting that you still hear everything about the East Coast, but nothing about the Midwest. And for that matter, the West Coast, down into Mexico and into the Gulf and the Caribbean that was involved in this story. So this, I think, has been an opportunity to expand the story.
Carolyn.
I can't help that putting my hand up. It's so school, but it works on Zoom too. Yes, exactly. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this book, and I think we've achieved it, is to provide new stories, because poor Harriet is tired. And I absolutely agree with you. But one of the reasons, and I'm going to sidebar here just a little bit about the project that Afua Cooper is spearheading at Dalhousie University right now, in which both Adrian Shad and I are involved, and also Natasha Henry. We're going to be tapping all of you on the shoulder at some point for this. It's called The Black People's History of Canada, but it tries to answer the question why there isn't more Black history in Canadian schools. And the reason is the reason we started it, and the reason the government has funded it, we received the largest grant ever given for African Canadian history education last April, a year ago April, for this. But it's because there isn't more Black history. It's because there's no BA, MA, or PhD in African Canadian history right now in all of Canada. History. I'm not talking about Black studies, I'm talking about history. And consequently, those few of us who do work on African Canadian history, and the few of you who do work in Michigan on African American history this period, we're the groundbreaking people providing new information, because so much of what is told in the Underground Railroad story is recycled older stories. I mean, I still hear the Wilbur Siebert stories all the time, and that's from the 1890s. So I think it's really important that we recognize that this volume is all new research, and that is something that we wanted to do and that we did do in order to contribute to a corpus of knowledge that needs to be expanded greatly. There is a lot more stories to tell. Of all the people who came to Canada on the Underground Railroad, we know a little tiny bit, about 600 out of almost 40,000 people.
Carol.
Thank you. I would like just to add to what everyone else has said, in that I think this book was so important in so many ways, drawing attention, as everyone has already said. But I think one of the other aspects of it is that it encompassed a long period of time, and it showed how the area changed and developed and became more active and helped more people. And, you know, both sides offered whatever they could, the goal being freedom. But I think too often in histories that I have seen, you know, about the movement, the anti-slavery movement, Underground Railroad, it makes everything seem stagnant. And this book started with some of the earliest stories, and how people were able to escape, people were able to fight for their freedoms. There, you know, were the riots, and then how these stories changed over time, and how the whole movement changed over time. And I think that's one of the benefits of this, is that we're doing away with all those myths. That this was just, oh yes, they somehow arrived at this gateway and this dock and went to the other side, and then that was it. No, you know. And I think the book, all of the chapters contributed in their way to making us see a much broader picture of this whole experience.
Thank you. I'm going to move to a question that kind of piggybacks on that. So we've talked about what people have previously understood about the Underground Railroad and the history of people of African descent in Detroit and their allies. What is it that you wish more people knew or understood about the history of the Detroit River Borderland in the 18th and 19th centuries? What do you wish more people knew or understood?
Wow.
I'll suggest two things. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Roy.
I was just going to suggest very briefly two things that jumped to mind. One is three things I'll say. One is that this was the key crossing point to Canada for freedom seekers that sought to go there. And that's not always understood nationally. I think it's, in addition to this book increasing that awareness, Fergus Bordovich's Bound for Canaan, which came out a decade earlier than ours, began to provide the evidence for that. And I use the phrase kind of half in jest, half seriously. There's a well-known book by Columbia historian Eric Foner that came out a few years ago called Gateway to Freedom. And it's looking at people going up the East Coast, Maryland, Philadelphia, New York. And in fact, if you're looking at sheer numbers, this was the true gateway to freedom in terms of going to Canada. Second, that if you look back early in the history, it's a much longer history, dating back to the 1790s, at least in terms of voluntary freedom seekers that we know that were doing that, and it picks up after the War of 1812. It's not just a post 1830 phenomenon as some Underground Railroad scholars try to paint it. And thirdly, the unique thing here for a time, late 18th, very early 19th century, that freedom seekers were going both ways across the borderland. You know, Canadian freedom seekers going to Michigan for freedom, and Michigan freedom seekers going to Ontario for freedom, or Upper Canada. And that's due to a number of unique legal circumstances that we could talk about. But it really makes this a much more complex phenomenon that sometimes people understand.
I try to make it simplistic when I speak to groups and do presentation, and I try to make it simple, make it plain. In this country, there were 100,000 approximately. Of course, everyone wasn't keeping track; it was secret. 100,000 cases of freedom seekers looking for freedom, running to freedom. So out of 100,000, out of 5 million people, and somebody actually told me there was only 400,000 people, and I have to pause on that there was only 400,000 people enslaved in this country. And I told this person they needed probably to check the census on that, because they needed to add a zero. We need to get into perspective how many people were actually enslaved until the Civil War. But that said, 100,000 of those folks were freedom seekers that used the Underground Railroad. But out of the 100,000, so we're still talking about a large amount, but not the total 4 million people, 4.5 million people that were enslaved. Anywhere between 20 and 25,000 crossed our 32 miles of river. So to put that in perspective, a quarter of this story, of this larger history known as the Underground Railroad, happened somewhere along our river, our Detroit River. So to maybe someone that doesn't study as much as we all do, obviously, or doesn't know many more stories, and would like to throw out that Harriet Tubman thing, then you give them the fact that this is really the story. The story of the Underground Railroad is here. So I'm just adding to what Roy put out there.
Well, what I would say in answer to that question, my own answer would be, there's so much emphasis on the operatives, the conductors, the station masters, those who were funding Underground Railroad operations, those who were donating, often kind of told from the perspective over many generations, from the perspective of kind of affluent white folks who had access to the press to tell their stories in the 19th century, when it was a good time to come out of the woodwork and say that you were an Underground Railroad hero of some kind. And there's just been this sort of erroneous perception that has pervaded our discussions about the Underground Railroad for far too long, that either there's like this solitary hero, superhero figure like Harriet Tubman involved, or that it was largely the work of these kindly white folks. And there were, of course, allies of European descent who were very extensively involved. But we don't really tell enough of the stories of the people who freed themselves, who had to make those daily, very difficult, courageous decisions to attain freedom under tremendously stressful circumstances, to put it mildly, and who shared information with one another informally to ensure that other people of African descent could also find their way to freedom, and who were risking, everything that they had to help others find freedom, who were risking everything, risking their lives and their safety to escape from slavery themselves, and just to make these tremendously complicated, incredibly difficult journeys. I think that's something people don't understand well enough. When I go into schools, whether it's virtually these last couple of years or in person prior to that, it's amazing how many elementary classes have learned all about Harriet Tubman, but have not heard any of the stories of people who entered Canada from this region, who came through the Detroit River region, or who used the Detroit River to cross over the other way to freedom, those stories aren't adequately told. And I'm so grateful to people like Chantel Browning Morgan and Christina Simmons and others who have been helping to develop the curriculum resources that will help those stories be better told. But we really need to do a much better job of getting people. I see your comment, Leslie. That's because they've seen your shows. Leslie McCurdy does a wonderful one-woman show about Harriet Tubman, and that's tremendous. And we're grateful for that work. But we want a greater array of stories to be told for sure. And also we want, I think, to get away from this common perception that exists that those individuals who crossed into Canada were then heavily assisted by the local white population and you know, the kinds of things that the old Heritage Minute commercials used to kind of convey about Canadian history with respect to the Underground Railroad, this idea that people came here and nice white folks helped them out and helped them get settled and everything was happy after that, and not really enough attention being paid to the tremendous work, collective and individual work that people of African descent who were freedom seekers had to engage in to establish themselves in this country, to seek the rights that were owed to them, to get the opportunity for enfranchisement and so on, and certainly to seek education for themselves and their kids. So those are the stories I wish were more told. Does anyone else want to comment on this question? Carol.
Yeah, I just like to say that I really appreciate what you just said, because that's more in the line of what I have done, which is like to take somebody's stories and have a personal touch and emotion come from people, and then they want to delve into more of the accounts and stories as sort of the Uncle Tom's Cabin way of reaching people and then opening their eyes to the facts. But I over the last few years have concentrated on one person, and that is John Felix White. And I nominated successfully 2 sites associated with him to the National Park Service listing. And I mean, I think and I've given, I don't know how many presentations, and I definitely need to write an article about all of this work. But I agree with you, from now on, I mean, I've done, I think, maybe 10 nominations to the National Park Service that have been successful for Michigan. And now I'm concentrating only on doing the ones that tell the stories of people who escaped rather than the people who helped them, because that's my focus. And I want those stories to be the ones that are told. But back to John Felix White, I think his story really should be shared with everybody. It should be told in the classroom because it brings up so much of what we know about this borderland. And the story is that he escaped from Kentucky around 1845. He was helped by Levi Coffin, who told him to stop at Laura Haviland's place and around Adrian and go to Canada. He went to Canada. He lasted about 3 weeks and he came back to Laura Haviland's. His intent was to rescue his family. So he refused to stay in Canada. And what he did then was use these Underground Railroad workers, Levi Coffin and Laura Haviland, to help him in his purpose of rescuing his family. He talked Laura Haviland into going to Kentucky. She actually went into Kentucky and went onto a plantation to try to help him rescue his family. So he was directing all of this. Meanwhile, he finally it was unsuccessful. So he made money to try to rescue his family. And then in late 1847, he was nearly kidnapped and his friends sent him to Canada. Again, he didn't stay because he wanted to make another trip to rescue his family, which he did. He was arrested and jailed. And then finally, after his Underground Railroad friends helped pay off the fees to get him out of jail, he went to Canada, and he was written up as part of the society with Henry Bibb and others. In 1852, on December 8th, 1852, he and Mary Jane Reynolds crossed the Detroit River to be married in Detroit by a Detroit minister. They went back to Canada and they raised their family until 1859. And then he moved to Wayne, then Oakland, then Washtenaw counties, and raised his family finally in Washtenaw County and was later buried in Ann Arbor. this is so complex, but it's so rich, and it tells so much about that movement and about a person driving their own story. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. So another question for our panelists, and it's kind of a dual question. And you've sort of touched on it a little bit already, but to an extent that's greater than what we've already said. What makes the Detroit River Borderland so important in the history of the Underground Railroad? I mean, we've talked about kind of the sheer numbers of people who crossed, but what else about the Detroit River Borderland makes it so important in the history of the Underground Railroad? Anyone?
I'll just be really quick. I had an answer to the earlier one too, but I didn't want to interrupt the story flow because that was wonderful. Caroline's fascinated. I will say just this one thing. The one thing that I wish that we could accomplish is correcting the fallacies about why Canada was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the legal history. And one of the things that I keep seeing published now is that it was because of the 1833 passage of the Slavery Abolition Act by the British. It was not. Upper Canada, and only Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, abolished the importation of slavery in 1793 as a direct result of the resistance and activism of a woman by the name of Chloe Cooley, who was being dragged across to a small boat to be taken across the Niagara River to be sold in upstate New York. And that gave Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe the political capital to be able to pass the first anti-importation law in all of the British Empire, and that by some 40 years. So I wanted to say that first, and I've lost my train of thought for the second question. Help me, Irene.
Sure. I mean, other than the sheer numbers of people who crossed at the Detroit River, what made this region so important in the Underground Railroad?
Second point on the same thing then, good. 1819, John Beverly Robinson, who was the very young Attorney General of Upper Canada, was asked by the governor of New York if he could allow slave catchers to go through. This is really early in the legal history of why Upper Canada could become a haven for people to go. I say it was a haven, but not a heaven on your point, Irene, about the racism people encountered. But he was asked if they could chase their prey to Amherstburg. And so this is the first piece of this on the Detroit River that we have record of in the legal history of Canada. And John Beverly Robinson basically decided to apply Lord Mansfield's view of British slavery, only actually applicable to the James Somerset case, that people could not be taken from Britain who had been living as free people and then re-enslaved. He said, once people get to Canada, they are no longer enslaved. They cannot be considered enslaved once they reach Canada. That happened at the Detroit River border. That set the precedent for all legal history for the Underground Railroad from that point forward in Upper Canada. And John Beverly Robinson was first the Attorney General and then the Chief Justice of Upper Canada up until 1861. He gets a bad rap on a lot of other stuff because he was a stickler for the law and he was really worried about people who are coming from slavery already having criminal past and all that stuff. But none of the Underground Railroad activism could have achieved its goal had it not been for that single decision and it being carried throughout that man's legal career. And that happened because of something at the Detroit River.
Thank you.
I'd add into that, Irene, I think my current work is showing me that the Detroit River Borderland, perhaps more than anywhere else, we can see evidences of the Native American or Indigenous contribution to the railroad. You know, the Wyandotte or Wendat villages along the southern part of the borderland at Brownstown and Monquagua and other places where they not only welcomed folks, but helped them get along across in those early years to Amherstburg / Fort Malden, which was the crossing point before Detroit in many ways in the early years, 1790s and early 19th century. As well as, you know, Northwest Ohio, you have groups like the Ottawa and the Maumee River Valley that are bringing folks northward to Amherstburg who are freedom seekers. When they make, you know, after the War of 1812, when they make their annual trek or river journey, sometimes they come by canoe. to get those benefits promised by the British, who they sided with in the War of 1812. They're bringing freedom seekers. And so I think there's a story to be told there. And one of the things I'm just really starting to become aware of are the Native Americans that, it's not just the Black communities and the occasional white who welcome them on the Ontario side. They're being welcomed by freedom seekers, and which is why, some Canadian Black and Indigenous scholars are beginning to talk about Black Ojibwa and other peoples in Ontario, and kind of talking about that identity, which brings up the descendant question that Kim and others have talked about. It's a continuing story.
I would just add also regarding the importance of the Detroit River Borderland. It was extremely important in Ontario history, in Essex and Kent counties, because by far the biggest populations of Blacks that settled in the 19th century were in Essex and Kent County. And we know this because of Michael Wayne's research on the 1861 census. And we know that he counted about 3,500 African Canadians in Essex County, and I think it was over 5,000 in Kent County. And those are the two counties closest to the Detroit River in Ontario. And that was important for a lot of reasons.
A very important point, absolutely. And I mean, especially for those who follow immigration history and about the closure of the borders basically to people of non-European descent in the years to follow, that population remained sort of the heart and soul of Canada's Black population, other than the Black Atlantic Canada communities, for a very long time, for sure. And so, when we look at that history in terms of the upsurge of interest in participation in the First World War and things of that nature, we see how important it was that those communities existed in this region. I want to move on to ask about your work since A Fluid Frontier was published. What have you learned about these topics since you contributed your work to A Fluid Frontier? And what do you see as new areas of research that should be explored with respect to the Detroit River Borderland, slavery, resistance to slavery, and the Underground Railroad? Roy, you've kind of alluded to some of the things that you've been doing lately. Would you like to expand on that a bit?
Well, I can touch on the two things. One, the Native American presence or Indigenous presence, which I see throughout the Old Northwest, but in those latter decades, particularly in the Upper Great Lakes region, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario. And one of the things I'm learning from all this, one, not only how important the oral story is. So one of the things COVID allowed me to do, or forced me to do, was a lot of virtual interviews with Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi elders, which informed me a great deal. But that in addition to the borderland here in Michigan, there is a northern door via the region south of the Sioux. And so there's a reason that Black Ojibwa turn up and Black settlements turn up north of where we traditionally talk about them. So the borderland's crucial, but people are going with Native American assistance in other routes into Ontario. The other thing that I've focused on a little bit as kind of a secondary project is, Carolyn, in a pioneering chapter in the book, talked about some of this earlier pre-1830, pre-Blackburn history, and that's so crucial. And one of the things I've learned is as valuable as Carolyn's pioneering work was, there's a lot more story to tell there, and we're starting to unpack that, I think. And I would urge people to go even deeper in that. I mean, the history is an old one, and Upper South freedom seekers coming north, the earliest I've been able to find is 1790. of a voluntary freedom seeker coming to Detroit. Probably once coming to other parts of the borderland before that. So there's a story to tell there that we're just beginning to unpack, I think, in the earlier history.
Anyone else?
Well, I can say that we're going to talk a little bit later about the Detroit River Project initiative. So I'm going to kind of leave that to the end of this day. However, I will say that it was a personal journey. The chapter that I wrote with Larry McClellan was actually, as I said earlier, on my family, and it allowed me an opportunity not only to, if you want to say, get to the bottom of some of these oral histories that had been passed around my family for so long, but it also gave me an opportunity to expand on the stories of other families. Most of the Underground Railroad families are interrelated, primarily just because of circumstance. We married each other. So there's a lot of the stories that overlap with each other. So it gave me an opportunity to see a broader vision of what actually was happening as families grew, as stories grew and expanded. And I've gotten a very broad understanding and a appreciation for our region as far as what the region means in the bigger story of the Underground Railroad, both nationally and internationally, because it beyond my family's story, the depth of the history and the depth of what actually has come out of our region just surrounding this river is immense. Newspapers and stories tied to the American Civil War, huge stories. Harper's Ferry actually was planned around our river. So it's really been an eye-opening experience, just beyond just what I was charged to do, and that was write about my family. But it's actually the broader story that has come out, I think, in the last few years. And I'll speak a little bit more on that when we talk about the Detroit River Project initiative.
Carol or Adrian or Carolyn? Carolyn, you're on mute.
Just was saying Adrian should go first.
Well, I guess this was already known, but I didn't know it. And what I've been doing in the past few years mostly is focusing on Toronto Black history. And one of the notable Black Torontonians of the 19th century was John Tinsley. And I just learned more recently that he was president and stockholder of the Canadian Mill and Mercantile Association, which was an organization set up to help the Buxton settlement, the Elgin settlement in southwestern Ontario. And he and Wilson Ruffin Abbott and Reverend King, who was the founder of the settlement, actually went to Detroit to buy the steam sawmill, which also was used as the grist mill. And they had to order parts from Cincinnati to turn it into both a sawmill and a grist mill. But they actually traveled to Detroit. So it just goes to show how important Detroit and Michigan was, and Ohio was for that matter, in the development of that settlement, because that was a very important development that enabled the Buxton settlement to become self-sufficient. And so, I mean, we know that Marianne Shad went to Detroit to print her very first pamphlet called Notes of Canada West. So, you know, that commercial and business network was also, important in the development of African communities, particularly the Elgin settlement or Buxton settlement. And I didn't know that, although it was known. So.
Wonderful. Carolyn?
I've been working recently. My first major freedom seeker biography was I've Got a Home in Glory Land, about the Blackburns. And my second one was about a woman by the name of Cecilia Jane Reynolds, who fled from her Kentucky owners who were related to Thornton Blackburns, the people who thought they owned Thornton Blackburn, which is how I found it. But Cecilia was 15 when she fled slavery, and she fled by way of the Niagara River border, by way of the Cataract House Hotel, which had an all-Black wait staff, a seasonal staff made up of waiters from both Canada and the United States. We traveled quite a distance to get there because it was a very lucrative job. But she was brought there by the family that thought they owned her in Kentucky, and she fled across the river with the help of the waiters at the Cataract House Hotel, which was one of many escapes via that particular hotel. One of the things that I have been working on in the last years, first of all, the entire Great Lakes Basin was a borderland for the Underground Railroad. We don't think of cities like Rochester or Toronto being borderland cities, but when they was the way to get back and forth was a steamboat, they were border cities. And every single person who fled slavery had to get across the water that divided the US from Canada, the major transit point being the Detroit River. But there were others. And so I've been working on comparative studies between the Detroit River Borderland and the Niagara River Borderland, the research of which is very much less than has been done over the years than has been done in Detroit. And there aren't the towering figures of people like George de Baptiste and the Bibbs and everybody who were involved with the Detroit River and whose stories are known. So the Niagara River stories are much more mysterious, and the communities on the Canadian side were much smaller. And consequently, that's just a beginning kind of research, but I'm doing comparative work between the two borderlands, the two river borderlands now.
Carol, do you have anything to add?
I don't know. I'm torn between so many different projects. I mean, I'm pretty much finished with working on John Felix White, and for the last few years. But in the process, I spent a lot of time conversing with everyone in Kentucky, in Boone County, Kentucky. The researchers there have been fantastic, and they have developed a wonderful website with their findings. And it, has led me to try to find more of those connections and wanting. I think one of the things I'm really wanting to do is to help people find their ancestors and find those connections. And some of that is just getting those names out there. And I'm thinking of ways to do that. And then the other thing is that in my book, I had focused quite a bit on the escape of the 28 that came out of, it was Fairfield had gone down and helped these people escape from Kentucky, and they came up through Cincinnati. And then, of course, they went to Canada, Upper Canada, where there was that's when the big banner that we all know of, that, fugitive slaves, that came out. Well, recently, I read that somebody is now calling them the Cincinnati 28. And I am so mad because I'm like, what? They a lot of time in Michigan. I know all the different places they stopped in Michigan. It was in my book. They went to Canada, and no, we cannot let them take away our story. So I'm going to have to figure out some way to make that better. Any ideas are most welcome. Thank you.
And on a similar note, I just want us to concentrate on reclaiming Elijah McCoy and the McCoy family. I know that so many people associate the McCoys with Michigan, and that's for very good reason. But I always want it to be known that Elijah was homegrown and one of us from this county. Everyone, thank you so much for participating in this panel. I have one last question that I will just ask Carolyn and Kimberly to answer if possible. What are your hopes for A Fluid Frontier, the volume, the collection of essays in the years to come? Carolyn?
what Kim is doing right now is the reification, and the total team related to the Detroit River Project and the curriculum that's being developed with Chantel Browning Morgan and everybody right now. By the way, I live about 20 kilometers from away where her great aunt lives in Nova Scotia. The connections are really interesting with that. But I will say that, reiterating what I said about the entire Great Lakes Basin being the borderland, I want to see the expansion of this study. I want to see the Detroit River designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of its importance to the Underground Railroad. Absolutely, we've all put huge amounts of our lives into helping make sure that happens. And I want to see our understanding of the transnational nature of African-American, African-Canadian activism being a cooperative effort rather than a one-way street from the United States to Canada, because that's been the image. You see the arrows in all of these images of these graphics of the Underground Railroad, but as Carol's work shown, people went the other way too, and Vita's work as well. We are looking at a much more complicated story than the simplified Underground Railroad tales have been up until now. And I think the more research that we do, the more we expand on the research that was started in the Fluid Frontier, the more we examine it in light of the rest of the borderland, the more we will come to understand how very, very brilliant and brilliantly organized the networks that help people get to freedom and who received them once they got there, and help them get on their feet, help people get on their feet once they got there, were from the point of view of the African-American and African-Canadian activism along these waterways. I think it is really, really important that we continue that work, but that we expand it beyond. We take the Detroit River as that crossing point and expand our understanding beyond that period and beyond that time frame, to be able to really tell the stories of how important that cross-border cooperation was and is. Thank you.
To piggyback on what Carolyn just said, sounds like a volume 2, Carolyn, which we joked about before. And with the Detroit River Project initiative, which I'll speak on a little bit later, and which has been brought up quite a few times already today, the need to focus the fact that this story that has been pervasive on both sides of the river border, both on Canada and on the United States, in the United States, of the white savior. It's still out there. I still get, statements said that, oh, well, the good white people got the folks and helped them. I think that the more that we talk about this subject, I believe that the World Heritage designation, as we're pointing toward 2027 for tentative listing, as we get closer to that, the stories are exposed further. And they're exposed on a national and international level, not just among the historians and researchers that you see before you. Now we're getting to the point where they're going to be exposed on a broader scale. And maybe we can get that white savior mentality buried for good. There were a lot of good people, white, black, free, enslaved, Indigenous. I mean, everyone was involved in this network. That's why it was a network. And I think that's what I am hoping beyond just the designation work, is to get the real story, because that's the real story, is people working together. That's the real story. And anyway, I think we've come a long way in the last 6 years, but we've still got a long way to go,
Dr. Carolyn Smarts-Frost, Kimberly Simmons, Adrian Shad, Roy Finkenbein, Carol Mull, thank you so much for being part of this panel. Our time with this particular discussion has come to an end, but I do want to point out that there have been some great questions and comments in the chat. One that was just posted there was a request for information about Francophone community involvement in the Underground Railroad. I don't know much about that. I suspect that a language barrier may have prevented some level of interaction between freedom seekers coming from English-speaking places and Francophone communities here. But if any of our scholars have information about that and want to direct our audience members to resources, please use the chat function for that. We're going to move on now with thanks to our panelists. To our next presenter, Carly Kochanek is a student, a third-year history and women's and gender studies student at the University of Windsor. She is currently working with the Leddy Library Archives and Special Collections, where she is assisting with ongoing projects to make archival collections more accessible to researchers. That's great stuff. She hopes to use the skills acquired throughout her undergraduate degree to pursue a career that highlights both of her areas of study, and is considering pursuing a Master's of Library and Information Sciences in the future. Carly's paper is titled Intersectionality in the Lives and Works of Marianne Shad and Henry Bibb. So Carly, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So the paper that I'll be presenting today was one that I worked on last semester for the course, The History of Slavery in North America from 1600 to 1877. And I essentially just wanted to focus on some local history. So I looked at Marianne Shad and Henry Bibb. So as most people might know, they were both abolitionists within the Windsor, Essex region, and used their respective newspapers to publish anti-slavery materials. And what I found is that within these papers, they often demonstrated how their ideas to achieve equality were different from one another. So I think that when studying these differences, it is important to understand why they held these opinions and how there are different identities such as like gender and class come into play when we're looking at this. So throughout this research, I found that Bibb and Shad had two major differences in their ideas on how to achieve equality. The first being on how reliant the fugitive slave community should be on monetary assistance, and then as well as whether or not they should integrate or separate themselves from white society. So a lot of the sources that I used within this research, are secondary sources particularly, I use them to kind of establish the basis of my research and look at the upbringings of Shad and Bibb and how that was influential in their views and what they shared in their papers in the future, and also just kind of compare some of the differences. And then I used Henry Bibb's The Voice of the Fugitive and Marianne Shad's The Provincial Freeman as my primary sources for this. The ones that I was looking at were from the years 1851 to 1857, so that's kind of the timeline I have here. And their individual papers are essentially a really good source for me to look at their opposing opinions, as many of the articles within these papers will showcase their own views. So the sources being used to conduct this research are really influential in the sense that it helped position the intersecting identities of both Shad and Bibb, and also allowed for kind of a feminist perspective on the topic. A lot of the background information provided within these articles are also important just to understanding why Shad and Bibb had different opinions and how those are influenced by their identities. So the basis of the research here, when I was looking at Marianne Shad, she was born as a free Black woman and was part of, the middle-class Black society of the time. So here we see that she did have some sort of an education and had some sort of economic capital. And this allowed her to be more knowledgeable on the opportunities that were offered to her as a Black woman. So we have to understand that although she was, somewhat privileged in the sense that she had an education and some sort of economic capital, she also still faced much discrimination based on her identity as a Black woman. So not only a lot of oppression that she faced was due to her race, but also she faced gender discrimination because at that time, women were not exactly supposed to take part in the public sphere. And even within the abolitionist community, she was viewed as unladylike for, voicing her opinions on abolition. So we have to consider class and as well as how gender, led her to being maybe viewed a little bit more negatively within the community, as she didn't really fit the traditional ideal of a woman at the time. So when looking at these papers, I had to keep in mind the fact that, she did have some sort of economic and intellectual privileges here, but she also, face some discrimination on the basis of gender as well. And then when looking at Henry Bibb, we know that he was born into slavery, and then after several attempts, he managed to escape and then establish himself in Canada. So because of his past as a previous escaped slave, he would not have had the same economic capital as Marianne Shad would have had, nor would he have had the same level of education. And then afterwards, when he did establish himself, in Canada, he did begin lecturing, on anti-slavery and publishing anti-slavery materials, and kind of, became a leader in the movement in this community. So when we look at Henry Bibb's identity as an escaped slave, we have to understand that he was not exactly granted the same intellectual opportunities as Shad, but we also have to understand gender as well in this case, and the fact that he was a man. So maybe his ideas may have been perceived differently by the community because, men were allowed to and more so encouraged to voice their opinions, on politics and be involved in the public sphere. So we have to take that into consideration as well. So looking at these differences in their intersecting identities was really important when I was examining these differences in their opinions within these papers. So the first main difference that I found while conducting this research were their views on assimilation and whether or not the Black community in the Windsor region should separate or integrate themselves from white society. So what I found was that Bibb took more of a separatist approach and felt that it would be easier for the community to achieve equality by creating their own, separate settlement where they could establish themselves. And within the Voice of the Fugitive, I actually found an article where he expresses this desire to establish a separate Black settlement where, they could have lots that would be sold to fugitive slaves and where they could establish, separate church and a school. So, they could live within, the segregated society. And then looking at Shad, she took a very opposite approach to this. She felt that the fugitive slave community should assimilate themselves into Canadian society and thought that these Black settlements were more temporary. Her pro-assimilationist views, I found them within the Provincial Freeman in an article where she outlines the duties of Black men. She discusses that in order to achieve the same rights as white individuals under the law, people of color should adopt the ways of the country to prove themselves worthy. And she felt that it was their duty to become as thoroughly British as they can, which is a quote that I took from the article there. Another aspect of that article that I thought was really interesting was towards the end, she even mentioned that she would rather do what is right than what is popular, which I think is important to consider when we look at gender. So when comparing these two opinions, I was able to link them back to their intersecting identities. So in terms of Bibb's opinion on establishing these separate settlements, it makes sense, the fact that he grew up in slavery and faced so much abuse at the hands of white individuals. So he may not have been as willing to assimilate into that lifestyle. Other scholars whose work I drew from discussed how separatism was perhaps a utopian response to this oppression and kind of was an escape from it. And his ideas of separatism may resonate with other fugitive slaves coming to the community. So we can see there how his past was influential in the views that he held and then published in his paper. Now, when it comes to Shad's views on assimilation, we have to consider that she was born as a free woman who grew up in the middle-class Black society of the time. So the discrimination and oppression that she faced may not have been to the same extent as someone who experienced slavery. Not to take away from the oppression she faced, but it wasn't exactly to the same extent. And this would perhaps make her more willing to assimilate into white society and make some more sacrifices in order to achieve equality. And then also the part towards the end where she mentions that she would rather do what is right than what is popular. When looking at that, I took gender into consideration and the fact that maybe she's aware that her opinions may not be as well received within the community because that she is a woman and that they weren't supposed to express their opinions so loudly within the public sphere. So I was able to relate that back to both the gender and class. The second difference that I found was quite common within these articles was the issue of self-reliance. So within this research, I found that Bibb often was more willing to accept these grants in order to establish these schools and churches and create these more permanent settlements, and was more willing to accept this monetary assistance so he could help, build this community for those who had recently escaped. So it's important to just kind of note that he wanted to use that to create these permanent settlements. Now, on the other hand, I found that Shad was very openly opposed to these grants that were being accepted and felt that it would stereotype the community in a negative way. And you can even see this in their paper. One that I felt very straightforward was the fact that the slogan on the top on the front page said self-reliance is the true road to independence. So already she's making it very obvious that, she felt that the community should be very self-reliant from the beginning. She does talk about how she felt that, this assistance should be provided, but it should be temporary. She also discusses how it will help, once again, prove that Black individuals are productive members of society who are deserving of freedom, and that becoming self-reliant is part of the process of integration. So once again, we're kind of seeing that idea of her wanting to prove that they're deserving of freedom within her paper there. So looking at the debates on self-reliance here, when considering Bibb's past once again as someone who had escaped slavery, we've come to the conclusion that he can kind of probably empathize more so with those who had just recently come to Canada and maybe wanted to provide more permanent support for them, which is something that he may not have had coming into Canada. So he can kind of understand the struggles that they're going through. And then when we look at Shad's views on providing more temporary support and pushing for self-reliance, this can also likely be tied to her economic status, and kind of might show some of her ignorance towards maybe the economic status of fugitive slaves coming in. A lot of the research I was looking at talked about how she viewed it as begging and thought that, it would stereotype the community negatively. So that is one other thing there, the fact that she grew up more so middle class and with more economic capital is kind of influential in her idea of self-reliance. So she may not fully understand the struggles that the fugitive slaves are going through, as she did have some sort of economic capital coming into Canada. So in this case, we could probably see more so fugitive slaves, agreeing more so with the views of Bibb, and then, the communities who are already established within Canada may resonate more with the ideas of Shad. Now, the third theme that I found that came up quite often through this research was the issue of temperance. Now, this one more so, Shad and Bibb did both believe that temperance was very important to their cause and important to the abolitionist movement. But I noticed that the way that they approached this idea was a bit different, and once again can be, related back to their identities. So they did share these views on temperance, but Bibb, in his newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive, he often promoted events about temperance where people could come and learn about it, and also even had ads within the paper that inquired about hiring, traveling temperance workers. And then within the Provincial Freeman, Marianne Shad discusses how, crimes are often a result of intoxication and can lead to higher taxes. She also talked about how people of color it would show that they saw themselves as equal and wanting to be acknowledged by the white population. So once again, we're seeing an idea of her wanting, to prove to the white population that, they were deserving of these rights. So when we look at the differences here, Bibb, in terms of hiring a temperance worker and holding temperance festivals, he's essentially trying to educate the fugitive slave community and provide them with an income, which is once again things that he was not able to receive growing up the way that he did. So once again, that can kind of go back to his previous identity as someone who was once enslaved. Now when we look at Shad and how she put emphasis on the fact that it would show the public that these groups were deserving of equality, can be related back to her previous views on assimilation and self-reliance, I found that that was a common theme, was the idea of proving themselves worthy of this. So even though within the issue of temperance, they did share this idea that they felt it was important to their cause, you can still see the differences behind their motives, and as well as how they're influenced by their intersecting identities. So, concluding this research, I essentially found that because of their identities, Marianne Shad and Henry Bibb shared these opposing views on separatism and assimilation, as well as the issue of self-reliance, which would most likely go on then to influence the community and those who shared similar identities to them. So although Shad and Bibb had these different opinions, and sometimes some being more respected than others, I think it's also important to know that they should not be demonized for either opinion, as they were just a product of their upbringing and the different life experiences that they had. So I think neither activist really held opinions that were inherently wrong. It was just different approaches to the same issue, and were just a result of their different experiences. And I think it's really important to, when doing this type of research, to understand that not everyone who experienced these different movements and issues experienced them the same way. By remaining ignorant to differences such as these is kind of in a way to remain ignorant to the idea that people experienced the abolitionist movement differently and people perceived it differently as well. So that was about it for my research that I had conducted. I just want to say thank you to the Essex County Black Historical Research Society for allowing me to share my paper here. It was really nice to hear from all the speakers beforehand, and it's quite an honor to be able to speak alongside so many accomplished people. So thank you for that. And then also just thank you to Dr. Wright for putting my name out there and allowing me to share my paper today. So thank you.
That was an excellent presentation, Carly. Thank you so much for being part of this forum today. Audience members, if you have any questions for Carly, we do have a couple of minutes remaining, so you can place those in the chat or in the Q&A feature if you wish. I do see that Carly's getting a lot of love in the chat, and that's a good thing. It's wonderful. That's one of the nice things about doing these types of symposia virtually. We get to actually see wonderful comments and cheerleading in the chat feature. So that's really nice. Okay, any questions for Carly? All right, seeing none, I think you're free to go out and enjoy your Saturday. But in any case, I do want to once again thank Carly and really express all of our great hope that you will continue this wonderful research and that you will have opportunities to learn so much more that will be just as thrilling and inspiring to you as this seems to have been. For those who are not joining us from our area, I do want to just mention that the Bibbs and Marianne Shad have been recognized quite a bit in recent weeks and months, and we're so thrilled with some of that recognition and those opportunities to shine a light on these important individuals and their stories. As many of you know, the University of Windsor will be unveiling a new fabulous bronze sculpture by local artist Donna Main, also an alum of the University of Windsor. That unveiling is happening at the downtown campus at the corner of Ferry and Pitt Street on May 12th in the morning. So we're so looking forward to seeing that sculpture finally unveiled. And as for the Bibbs, they have been featured very heavily in the new documentary that will be released in June, Across the River to Freedom, of which I'm co-executive producer. Our director is Anish Ray Singh once again, and really some stellar information about Henry and Mary Bibb is part of that documentary, and we're so thrilled that more people will be able to learn about them as a result, especially educators and students. And as many of you may not know if you're not from Windsor, last February, we had the great pleasure of seeing a City of Windsor park renamed Mary E. Bibb Park, just adjacent to where their federal historic plaque is, mentioning that they are persons of national historic significance in Canada. So we're so thrilled that those things are happening. All of those kinds of public recognitions, in addition to scholarly work that's being done, help to shine a light on these important individuals and stories. And so we're so glad that that's occurring. Our next speaker is Willow Key. And I must say, Willow Key is a tremendously gifted graduate student. We at the Essex County Black Historical Research Society are happy to have her as a member, but also we've been working with her pretty extensively on a new project, and we'll share a bit of information about that. So Willow Key completed her Bachelor of Arts in History at the University of Windsor and is currently in the first year of her master's degree in history. Her major paper will explore post-war urban redevelopment planning and its impact on Black communities in Canada. She served, or she is serving, as lead researcher for the We Were Here, Recovering the Stories of the McDougall Street Corridor project as part of the University of Windsor's Anti-Black Racism Student Leadership Experience grant and in partnership with the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. So Willow will be sharing some information about the project that she is working on. We Were Here, Recovering the Stories of the McDougall Street Corridor, and why that's important and what she's been learning. Willow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irene. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to set up here. I have a presentation or a PowerPoint. Let me see. Okay. Let me know if you can see the screen.
I am so far unable to see the screen. I'm not sure whether anyone else can as yet.
Okay.
Here we go.
Oh, you can see it. Okay, perfect. Sorry, it took a minute there. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So hello, everyone. My name is Willow Key, and as Irene mentioned, I'm a graduate student at the University of Windsor, and my research is focusing on Black Canadian history in the post-war period. So I'm looking at urban redevelopment. Thank you to the Essex County Black Historical Research Society and the University of Windsor for organizing this event. And I'll leave a few questions at the end, I'll leave a few minutes at the end if anyone has any questions about the presentation. Okay, so the research I will be discussing comes from the We Were Here, Recovering the Stories of the McDougall Street Corridor project in partnership with the University of Windsor and the Essex County Black Historical Research Society. My project focuses on the collection and preservation of Black stories and experiences regarding urban redevelopment and uprooting in the McDougall Street Corridor, a predominantly Black neighborhood located in the heart of Windsor's downtown core. Historically, Black Canadian communities have been particularly vulnerable to urban redevelopment planning due to the failure of the state to observe what made Black Canadian communities possible, their unique history, and their importance to the continued success of neighborhoods and districts. This project will attempt to display the full and rich experiences of Black Canadians in the city of Windsor, the effects of urban redevelopment on the community, and will provide former residents and members of the community a chance to share their experiences with the public. So the McDougall Street Corridor is demarcated roughly by Riverside Drive, Glengarry Avenue, Erie Street East, and Goyou Avenue. This is where the majority of the community was concentrated, though there were members of the Black community that lived slightly outside of this area. The McDougall Street Corridor's Black settlement started in the early to mid 19th century when freedom seekers, Black men and women who were enslaved, as well as free people of color, traveled to Canada from the United States via the Underground Railroad in search of freedom and better opportunities. At first, the number of people coming across the border was relatively small, but following the establishment of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, there was a surge of freedom seekers traveling to Canada, and some historians suggest anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 people crossed the border during this time. So freedom seekers from the United States would cross the Detroit border into Windsor, and they received medical care and temporary housing from Windsor's former army barracks, located roughly where City Hall is today. Some men and women chose to stay in the area. People wanted to wait for loved ones to join them, or they wanted to be close to family members that were living in Detroit. And the border has always provided work opportunities for people, so many people chose to stay. And these factors led to the settlement of what would become the McDougal Street corridor. The community evolved over the next century, establishing schools, businesses, churches, hotels, community centers, and neighborhood activities and celebrations. The community was extremely close-knit. Many families were connected through marriage. And many of the former residents I've spoken with have shared that the McDougal Street corridor really felt like one big family. It served as a safe space for Windsor's Black residents. It's important to mention that Windsor did not have legal housing segregation, but there was, to a certain extent, social segregation, especially in the form of residential covenants. So essentially, there were only a handful of locations in the city where Black residents were permitted housing. And this is what resulted in the McDougal Street corridor becoming so popular amongst Black families throughout the early 20th century. However, the McDougal Street community, as residents knew it, was forever altered when the city of Windsor decided to participate in a federal program to redevelop urban areas in the 1950s. Windsor's Black community fell victim to urban redevelopment planning, an increasingly common practice in post-war North America. Governments, both federal and provincial, attempted to remove or raze areas that were deemed blighted or run down, often resulting in the uprooting of culturally significant working class communities in the process. The Canadian government was especially concerned with overcrowding in urban centers as a result of anticipated population growth after the Second World War. Under the National Housing Act, the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation would assess municipal plans for redevelopment, and if approved, cities would receive anywhere from 50 to 75% of their funding from the federal government, beginning in the early 1950s. This program was extremely popular across the country in the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. But of course, redevelopment tends to have competing interests. So there's the interest to improve aesthetically a community and to improve living conditions. But then you also have commercial interests. And I've found in the case of the McDougal Street corridor that commercial interests trumped in many ways the needs of the residents in the area. And this is supported by a 1964 article and many other documents in which some Windsor city councilors expressed concern over redevelopment setbacks relating to inadequate accommodations and urban flight within the area. Specifically, immediately after the demolition, there were not appropriate accommodations for people to move into public housing. So Windsor's urban redevelopment project began in 1959 with the demolition of numerous blocks throughout the McDougal Street corridor, most notably the area where the casino and City Hall are located today. So the area bound by Riverside Drive, McDougal, Wyandotte, and Goyou. Many of these properties were expropriated by the city of Windsor and used to build and expand a new City Hall, as well as provide parking. The plan called for the downtown core to be divided into 3 redevelopment locations, so areas 1, 2, and 3, which would include residential, commercial, and municipal buildings. And these are some of the plans here on the screen. So areas 1 and 2 are bound roughly by the McDougal Street corridor, and within this area, approximately 34% of the population was Black, so about 40 families. And of course, the Black population extended further towards Jackson Park, but it was this area inhabited by these 40 families that was raised. And just an interesting point, urban redevelopment report conducted by the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation in 1959, so the same year that Windsor was approved for its redevelopment. The report recognized that many of the targeted locations for redevelopment, not just in Windsor, but across Canada, were inhabited by, quote, ethnic minorities, specifically Black and Chinese Canadians. And so the report initially stated that it would be to the best interest of the cities to ensure that these communities were able to remain intact and that they were able to stay or be rehoused on the new sites of the redevelopment planning. However, the National Housing Act never defined what exactly constituted as blight, leaving the responsibility to the individual municipalities to establish their own criteria. And so this left community, specifically Black and Chinese communities, vulnerable to discrimination, apathy from city officials, and exploitation. So when surveyed, over 80% of the participants from the area stated that they were content with their living conditions. And this is significant because it tells us that the public opinion for this project in Windsor, specifically in the McDougall Street corridor, was very different from the various scathing reports that were published by the city regarding living conditions and health and safety concerns. As well, the federal government had a number of alternative initiatives, such as a loan program for homeowners, which would have addressed homes that needed updating while still allowing residents to remain in their homes. However, this was not the route that the city of Windsor chose. Instead, they decided that the entire area needed to be repurposed. And so redevelopment occurred swiftly, and residents had very little chance in reacting to the pressures of redevelopment and the expansion of City Hall, and then additional commercial interests for the area. So many members of the community were forced to leave the area once the redevelopment project commenced, which would have been late 1959. And this resulted in properties and gathering places being demolished, marking a decline in the area's historic Black presence. The uprooting of this close-knit community impacted families and their connections to one another, as well as limiting important community and cultural events. And just a side note, public housing was made available by the early 1960s, but again, the redevelopment project started in the late 1950s, 1959. So not only did the units come quite late, but the units were in high demand and in short supply. And so many families felt that the standard unit size would not properly accommodate larger families. And in this case, for many of the Black families, they tended to have more than 2 children. And also they had extended family living with them. And so this resulted in many families leaving the area. And in some cases, families left the city of Windsor altogether. So these are images from Windsor's Emancipation Day celebrations, a decades-long tradition of celebrating the end of slavery within the British Empire. Organized by William Perry, also known as Mr. Emancipation, through the British American Association of Colored Brothers of Ontario at the beginning of August of every year. Residents of the McDougall Street corridor and other residents around Windsor and also Detroit would gather in the heart of the Black community to watch and participate in the weekend's events. The Emancipation Day celebrations and the publication Progress magazine, which would feature the weekend's festivities and key speakers, demonstrates only a fraction of the importance Windsor's Black community held in the protection and promotion of Canadian Black history and keeping the connection between Black Canadians and Black Americans alive. And here on the screen, we can see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who came to Windsor's Emancipation Day celebrations in 1956, as well as Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth from Birmingham, Alabama, in 1962. And many civil rights leaders and activists came to Windsor during the post-war period to share with Canadians the struggle of Black American liberation. Of course, following the redevelopment, families began leaving the area, businesses left, and eventually so did emancipation celebrations. The impact of this redevelopment project is still very much alive today. Within the Black community in Windsor, many families have fond memories of the neighborhood. Before redevelopment, the community has had several organized events for former residents to catch up, share stories and photos. And there's been a tremendous effort by Nancy Allen from the North Star Cultural Center to collect and preserve stories within the community. So there's still a desire from current and former residents to hold on to and celebrate the achievements of the Black community in this area. So urban redevelopment affected numerous communities, not just Black communities, but for my research, I'm looking at the effects on Black communities in Canada. So here in Canada, as well as the United States, historic Black communities became the focus of government urban redevelopment planning. So just to mention a few of these communities in Canada, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Africville in Nova Scotia. This is probably our country's most well-known example of failed urban redevelopment. Others include Hogan's Alley in Vancouver and the Strathcona community in Victoria, BC. And both of these communities, the Vancouver community and Victoria community, were redeveloped to make way for on-ramps for a highway and low-income housing. And then Detroit also saw redevelopment, the redevelopment of two Black communities, Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, to make way for the I-375 highway. In the 1950s and 1960s, these historic communities were forced to relocate or dissolve completely as a result of urban redevelopment, which led to families being separated, and the cultural connections that served to bind these communities together were either significantly strained or completely destroyed. And these plans were often sold to the public, both in Canada and the United States, as projects to improve health and safety conditions and to provide better opportunities. But really, many of these projects were established without the consent or responsible consultation of the affected communities. And as a result, Black people were pushed out of their homes, many lost businesses, and in some cases, they experienced forced removals, and that was the case for some people in Africville. So studying post-war urban redevelopment is relevant today for a variety of reasons, but one of them being the continued impact of redevelopment planning in Black communities across North America. For instance, Little Jamaica in Toronto is currently under construction for the new LRT subway line. And so many of these Jamaican businesses and residents have been forced to shut down or move due to prolonged construction, as well as astronomical rent prices. And we're now seeing this vibrant community that was established in the 50s and 60s, as well as the community at Bloor and Bathurst, which is also another Jamaican community in Toronto, struggling to survive as a result of economic circumstances that have only been exacerbated by the city as well as poor city planning. And so, some of these problems certainly could have been avoided by the city of Toronto, and these are choices we have to examine critically when we're talking about urban redevelopment and Black communities. By remapping the McDougall Street corridor, we can demonstrate to Canadians that the Black experience in Canada was not static. Black lives continued after the arrival of freedom seekers with the creation of communities, towns, businesses, schools, churches, and recreational areas. Windsor's Black community has continued to keep the memory of the McDougall Street corridor alive through stories, monuments, and celebrations to reinforce the presence of Black Canadians in southwestern Ontario, their accomplishments, and the enduring legacy of their ancestors. Finally, on the screen are images of the BME Church, which was originally located on McDougall Street. The impact of urban redevelopment in the city of Windsor is best understood through the tireless fight the church participated in to remain in this area. Built by the hands of newly freed men and women, this century-old building was one of the last buildings within the Black community to be expropriated by the city. Churches are so important to the Black experience and to Black communities in Canada. in keeping traditions alive and families and neighbors close and connected. The BME Church understood this very well and feared that redevelopment would inevitably fracture the community. And so their fight in court and out of court, was a fight not just for their land, but also for their congregants and for the Black community as a whole. So thank you everyone for sticking around, and I can take any questions.
Okay, once again, lots of love in the chat. Are there any questions for Willow? Thank you, Willow Key, for this excellent, excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Lila Happy, go ahead and type your question.
Yes, Irene. Not sure if you can hear me or not.
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to commend Willow for a fantastic and illustrious presentation there. I learned a lot. I don't learn a lot in one sitting about South Detroit, as I call downtown Windsor. But I want to know if we have access to her work, if there's a link or something like that that she can share in the chat.
Right now, I'm just sort of finishing up research and working on remapping the area, but I will have resources within the next few months. So I'm sure the Essex County Black Historical Research Society can share that information. So if I don't know if you follow them on social media, but or the Facebook page, but that information will be up shortly. Thank you.
Yes, and I should add that the We Were Here project certainly includes some knowledge mobilization efforts that will take place once the research has been more or less completed. So there will be multiple ways in which that will be shared. Since we've had one live question, let's go to Lila Happy. And Lila, would you like to ask your question live?
Sure, Irene. I did just finish typing it in the chat, but I will ask it. Firstly, Willow, thank you for your excellent presentation. I really enjoyed listening and learning from you. So my question is, how can the University of Windsor share the rich history of Black people within Windsor-Essex region, within recruitment practices or what we learn in class for Black students to feel more belonging here? And I share this because I am an international student, and when I moved to Windsor, I had no idea that this place was so rich in Black history, and I think that I would have felt more belonging to this place. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I agree, actually. So I'm originally from Toronto, but my dad has family here in Windsor, and I didn't know very much about the Black community in Windsor either. I didn't know that there was such a rich history here. So I think even if you're a descendant of the Underground Railroad, or if you're new to Canada or new to this area, the University of Windsor certainly can do quite a lot more to promote the Black history in this area. I'm sure perhaps like undergraduate courses that focus on Black history in this region, specifically in the history department, would be really helpful. But even more than that, I think any Black associations on campus would benefit from being able to share this information with members or students in their groups. So I think there are a number of different ways that this information can be sort of disseminated amongst students on campus. I guess it sort of just depends on, how interested the university is in sharing it. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Willow Key. That was extraordinary. And that's just a taste of the amazing research that Willow is working hard to conduct. And we're so grateful for all of your efforts to date. So we're moving on to our final session of this event. You've already met Kimberly Simmons, of course. Kimberly will be joined by Chantel Browning-Morgan. For those who don't know Chantel Browning-Morgan, she has been a teacher with the Greater Essex County District School Board since 2001. She is an Underground Railroad descendant who is very passionate about Black history. Chantel is a graduate of the University of Windsor, where she obtained an honors degree in French language and literature, a Bachelor of Education, and a Master of Education with a concentration in curriculum development. She has been the secretary of the Essex County Black Historical Research Society for a number of years, is a co-founder of the Black Staff Equity Alliance, and is active in many community organizations and events. In 2011, Chantel was a recipient of the Governor General's Award for Excellence in Teaching Canadian History for piloting an innovative African Studies course. Additional awards and honors have included the Windsor and District Black Coalition Award, the University of Windsor's Odyssey Award, Professionally Speaking Magazine's Exemplary Teacher, and the Sisterhood Award from Women's Enterprise Skills Training of Windsor. Chantel was featured in CBC's 2015 edition of Being Black in Canada. In 2020, she was featured on the first Black History Month Wall of Fame in Windsor. In addition to teaching, Chantel has contributed to the development of the GECDSB's African Canadian Roads to Freedom curriculum support documents, the Chatham Colored All-Stars K-12 curriculum, OSSTF's Canadian Black Lives curriculum, Teach Magazine's lesson plans on Viola Desmond, and Resistance Along the Fluid Frontier, the Detroit River Project International Freedom Curriculum. And I am happy to say that Chantel is currently developing educational resources for our new Across the River to Freedom documentary series. She is also, in addition to all of that stuff, the mother of 3 children. So please welcome Kimberly Simmons and Chantel Browning-Morgan, who will be talking about the Detroit River Project, international designation for the Detroit River, and other next steps. I also want to say before they begin, because we got a little bit of a late start due to technical issues, I'm going to beg the audience's indulgence to let us go not till 12:30, but to 12:40 if possible, so that we can complete this discussion. So just giving you a heads up. Kimberly and Chantel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Irene. That was a lovely introduction. I am so happy to be surrounded by such brilliance. There is brilliance on the screen that I see in front of me, and brilliance in my ears as I talk to Chantel about what we're doing, in particular, the educational curriculum. Carolyn Smarts-Frost has given us she and Vita Tucker have given us a wonderful resource to use moving forward with the Detroit River Project. Let me see if I can accomplish sharing my screen. Some days I'm better at it than others, but we're going to try this. And well, look at that. I even accomplished it. Okay. Can everybody, I hope everybody can see my screen. What you have before you is the new and improved website, the DetroitRiverProject.com. And I do wish that you go and after our symposium is over and view it. It's still a process in the making, but DetroitRiverProject.com is the web address. Let me share with you, we've talked about it, we've talked around it, but let me share with you how we got to the point we are today with a symposium using the brilliant volume written by Carolyn co-edited by Carolyn Smarts-Frost and Vita Tucker, with the lovely co-contributors of mine, myself, Irene Moore Davis, Brian Prince, Roy Finkenbein, Carolyn Smarts Frost and Vita Tucker both wrote a chapter. Larry McClellan, my co-author in crime, as I call him. Adrian Shad, Barbara Washington, Debbie and Marty. Let's see, who am I missing? And Afua Cooper. It was a project that came out of this vision that I had back in 2008. And the vision was the Detroit River Project. Imagine being in a place, in a region where history is on every corner. Now, you will say that history probably exists on every corner in America and in Canada, but in our special region, our region goes back to thousands of years. On the American side, there is actually an Indigenous burial mound. There are showcases of American history and Canadian history on both sides of the Detroit River. In one block, I will say, in Sandwich Town, which is the Windsor enclave on the Canadian side of our river, you literally standing on a corner can see in one block a National Historic Site, which is Sandwich Baptist Church, of which my family was a part of building, were the founding members. The building itself dates back to 1851. However, the congregation dates back to the late 1820s. And imagine standing on the corner of Peter and Watkins Street and being able to see from your vantage point the place where towering figures, icons of history, such as Henry Bibb, such as Marianne Shad, Carey, historic Sandwich Baptist Church, which houses one of the oldest African Canadian congregations in Canada, that was visited by not only Henry Bibb, who was a member, and Marianne Shad, who was a member, but saw the opportunity to feed, after he spoke, Frederick Douglass, who saw the likes of John Brown show up with passengers that he had liberated out of the South, out of the American South. That's standing on one corner, Peter and Watkins Street in Windsor, Ontario, Sandwich. On the American side, you have within the 32-mile boundary or stretch of the Detroit River, of which, of course, a 10-year-old told me once, Miss Kim, it's not a river, it's a strait. And yes, it is. It links the St. Clair River to Lake Erie. However, we older people call it a river. It is historic. It is a Canadian heritage river. It is an American heritage river. At one end of it, it actually houses what is known as the International Wildlife Refuge, back down in Trenton, which is the west end of the river. And everything that is encompassed in this 32-mile stretch on both sides of the river, that has been going on for thousands of years, has never really gotten its full potential realized. Cultural economic development, tourism, is something we've never really, it's never been a part of us. But as a longtime member of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, which is the Network to Freedom initiative out of the National Park Service, I wrote my first designation in 2003. And most recently, the last designation I wrote was 2016, and it was in partnering with my wonderful friend, Carolyn Smarts Frost, and that was the acknowledgement and designation of the jail site where the Blackburns were actually held and escaped to freedom in downtown Detroit, right behind the CompuWare building, for those of you that know about that. That was done in 2016. And that place, Carolyn, I think, touched on, is the place where the Canadian extradition policy today still emanates from. That was 1833. That is not just American history, that's Canadian history and international history. We actually, on the American side, are housing a place, or have a place, that Canadian extradition policy is driven from today in 2022. These are all pieces of our Detroit region's history. They all emanate from our river. I was a member of the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission for 2 terms. And as I was term limited off in 2010, I took a strategy with me that I had placed on the table that said, perhaps we need to look at a broader opportunity to tell our region's story. We can tell it by writing designations on corners, such as the Blackburn designation, or on the Canadian side, the historic Sandwich Baptist Church designation. However, why not share our story to the depth that it was actually should be shared, and that is World Heritage. World Heritage designation, the opportunity actually did not come from me, and it wasn't it has become my vision, but it came from a conversation had with Parks Canada, which is the counterpart to the National Park Service on the Canadian side. Having a conversation about a designation that I thought was good, and that would be to designate the historic Detroit River to the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. I was told very definitely by a gentleman by the name of Gordon Fulton, who at the time was the director of National Historic Sites for the province of Ontario on the Canadian side. And he said, Kim, it sounds this, yes, the river story needs to be told on a bigger scale, but you sure are shooting low. And I was talking about just a national designation, and was asking if Canada would be willing to sign off, because we all must remember the Detroit River. If you don't live here, let me say to you, the Detroit River is an international border. So halfway between both countries is a border that binds us together. And he said I was shooting too low and needed to broaden my scope. Hence, that was September 2008. And it was at that point the Detroit River Project was born, and the push for UNESCO, United Nations, designation for our 32-mile strait, also known as a river. There are approximately 1,100 World Heritage Sites in the world. So we're talking about adding our river to that list, that illustrious list. And you can't write an application, sign your name, and send in your $20 and become a member of this 1,100 VIP list. You have to prove that you belong, because anyone nominated to a World Heritage site, any site designated World Heritage by the UNESCO arm of the United Nations, has to show that what their history or their culture, or it can be a building, a facility, there are many ways to be designated, has world significance. If I say to you, I'll mention a few that would probably bring that to mind. We'll say Grand Canyon. We'll say Statue of Liberty. We'll say Ellis Island. Those are World Heritage Sites. And when you mention those, immediately you know to which we're speaking. You know what we're talking about. Well, guess what? Our river, in all of its 32 miles, has seen the birth of, let's think about this, the birth of a car. We put the world on wheels from our river. The first Ford Motor Company plant was on the river. As a matter of fact, the machinist who tinkered while working in the Detroit shipbuilder's yard, tinkering in between building ship engines, he tinkered and came and perfected the combustion engine, and that his name was Henry Ford. He literally created the combustion engine on the river, our river. Think about that. That in itself is a world event. We don't even have to add anything else. That's a world event. But here, as we're sharing our river story, we're sharing it using the largest movement of people, the largest entertainment of civil discourse and disobedience that is the world has ever known. And that is the Underground Railroad. And as I mentioned, for those of you that were with us a little earlier, the Underground Railroad, there were 5 million people enslaved in this country, close to 5 million. There were only 100,000, though 100,000, as we all know, is a large amount, but 100,000 people that actually were part of this network known as the Underground Railroad. But between 20 and 25,000, as we approximate, used our river, somewhere along that 32-mile stretch, to find freedom on the other side. So if you take that into account, a quarter of the history, the story of the Underground Railroad happened along the riverbanks in the Detroit River region. That is why I have formed a coalition. We are known legally as the Detroit River Project, but we are, as a coalition, known as the Detroit River Project Initiative. The Detroit River Project Initiative has literally been going on since 2008, as Carolyn alluded to, as the Fluid Frontier became real when we actually got published. However, the last 4 months, we've really been stepping on the gas. And we are thankful that January the 4th, we were joined officially by the Consul General of Canada, at Detroit, Joe Comartin, who has put his support as well as his office's support behind this effort now to get this to happen. There's kind of levels to how this all kind of works out. The Detroit, you can't just say you want to do this, present your research and you happen on. No. This is a process that starts with what they call a tentative list. Tentative list is to get to a tentative list, you have to present the United Nations, the World Heritage Convention, with enough data and research to share the opportunity for them to make a decision. Tentative listing doesn't happen all the time, and the next time the tentative list for UNESCO is not until 2027. So we're building our efforts between two countries for that to happen. The international issue will actually be taken out of the hands of all the people around it. But actually, when you're talking about an international border, you're talking about two countries coming together. And we are very fortunate that the Consul General has moved forward. We are now working on with the State Department, because this has now become an issue of state. This is an exciting time. It is a time that we in this region should take advantage of. We have never been, as a region, able to share our stories. We've always been kind of a blue collar region. That comes from having the car here. We have always been a region that just worked. And we never thought that what we were doing was world worthy. It is. And we need to recognize that we need to educate those that don't know how big of a deal we are, to let them in on that secret So the way that's going to happen is World Heritage designation. The Detroit River Project initiative houses several different pieces. You've heard a little bit about the piece, a big piece of it, the research that was done that actually turned out the book, A Fluid Frontier. We have several other big initiatives that are showcasing our river and the river stories. In just a minute or so, you're going to hear about a very large piece of that, and that is the educational curriculum. Resistance along the river. The Detroit River Project International Educational Curriculum was a team effort led by our great team leader, and that is Chantel Browning Morgan. It is a dream of mine that we educate our children across our border. We live on an international border that's a little different from many, and that is there are many people on both sides of the border that share the same history. We all share the history, but literally we have people that live on both sides of straddle that border that have families that share history across the border. And that history has never been told properly because the history actually starts on one side and feeds another, or is still feeding both sides. You have one history shared by this river border that actually just mirrors itself. It depends on which side of the river you're living on. That story has never been given to our children, to know that they literally are internationally driven. We have now given them an opportunity, a vehicle to learn their story, learn our stories, and be able to share it with the world. So our curriculum, which Chantel is going to speak on in just a few minutes, is the first of its kind. It has UNESCO's interest, the National Park Service and Parks Canada's interest, and both countries are interested to drive this curriculum further. We also have a heritage camp that's run during the summer. We had to, of course, cancel it the last two summers because of our pandemic. However, we're hopeful this summer that we will be able to share our International Heritage Camp, known as Camp Freedom. It is geared for students between the ages of 10 and 14. It's a 2-week immersion into the out of doors, which we have a lot to share, as well as the history of our river. So I'm going to stop there. If you've got any further questions, I would say go to the DetroitRiverProject.com and look at the website. There's an opportunity to send messages. And of course, there is a donation button because we are currently in the midst of funding. If you have any interest in joining us, we'd love to have you. But I'm going to turn over a little bit of time to my lovely co-educational team member, and that's Chantel Browning Morgan. And she's going to tell you about this fantastic curriculum that we are actually piloting. Literally, we are in official pilot mode with 3 districts, Canadian school districts on the Canadian side and 3 on the American side. We've got almost 40 teachers, educators that are actually working with the project as of last Wednesday. So I'm going to turn over the mic to Chantel, and she can share a little bit more with you.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you, Irene, for the introduction. It's such an honor to share the virtual stage with so many of you. Before I talk about the curriculum, I'd personally like to thank all of the contributors to A Fluid Frontier. This book is always by my side. It was the #1 resource that I used while developing the curriculum and all of the case studies. And it's just an honor to be here with so many of you today. I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the curriculum that Kimberly just spoke of. Resistance Along the Fluid Frontier is the Detroit River Project International Freedom Curriculum, and it has been designed for students in grade 7 in Ontario and 8th grade in Michigan. The purpose of this curriculum is for students to learn what it means to do history.
as they become community historians and explore the early history of abolition and the Underground Railroad. They'll be exploring resistance to slavery, organizing, border crossing, and freedom seeking in the Detroit River Borderland. The duration of the curriculum is approximately 3 to 4 weeks. In the first week, students will learn about slavery and resistance in Michigan and Canada. They will also engage in community building activities and learn how to analyze primary source documents from the perspective of a historian. In the second week, students will explore and analyze case studies. They will work with primary source documents and multimedia resources, which were developed by some of the historians on the panel here today, where they will learn about the stories of freedom seekers. There are a total of 9 case studies, which follow a jigsaw format. So there will be 9 groups of students in each class, and each group will become experts in their particular case study, and then they will share the knowledge with the rest of the class. For the case studies, I focused on Nelson Hackett, Madison and Tabitha Lightfoot, Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, the Colored Vigilant Committee of Detroit, the Refugee Home Society, the Provincial Freemen, the Voice of the Fugitive, John Anderson, and the Dennison family. All 9 case studies are inquiry-based, and each case study comes with a central historical question for students to investigate and answer. For example, for the students who receive the John Anderson case study, they will be required to answer the question, was he a hero or a murderer? Or for those who receive the Nelson Hackett case, they will answer the question, should Nelson Hackett have been extradited to Arkansas? Each case study has a wide variety of primary source documents, and students will answer historical thinking questions for each primary source by using reading strategies such as sourcing, contextualizing, corroborating, and close reading. Students will evaluate the trustworthiness of multiple perspectives and learn to make historical claims backed by evidence from the primary sources, which include, but are not limited to, photographs, testimonies, letters, petitions, books, advertisements, meeting records, wills, sketches, and newspaper articles. So that will take up the second week. In the third week, students will create a proposal for either a museum exhibit, a public mural, a children's book, or a historical landmark that honors and celebrates the person or organization they studied. They will develop a visual or multimedia display as well as a pitch presentation with an overview of their study. A focus of their presentations will be on how we can learn from and be inspired by the heroes of that time period as we continue the work of freedom seeking in our region. And lastly, in week 4, students will deliver a public presentation. It is our hope that throughout the process, and especially during the public presentations, that classrooms in Essex and Kent counties and classrooms in Michigan will be able to connect, even if it's virtually, so that students can engage in cross-border discussions and knowledge sharing about the lessons they learned. As Kimberly mentioned, I am so pleased that we have 3 school boards on the Canadian side of the Detroit River and 3 on the American side that have already begun piloting this curriculum with their students. I owe tremendous gratitude to Kimberly Simmons for her vision, which has been the driving force behind the development of this curriculum. I'd also like to thank the partner organizations. The lead organization is the Detroit River Project, the Essex County Black Historical Research Society, the Center for Education, Design, Evaluation, and Research, the University of Michigan Detroit River Story Lab, and the University of Michigan Wolverine Pathways Program. I would also like to thank the following individuals who contributed to the development of resources for students: Kimberly Simmons, Dr. Carolyn Smarts-Frost, Irene Moore Davis, Dr. Lorene Bridgen-Lenny, and Dr. Roy Finkenbein. And I'd also like to thank my curriculum partners, Dr. Darren Stockdale and Samantha Adams, who played instrumental roles in the development of this curriculum. Thank you so much. I will now turn it back over to Kimberly Simmons.
Thank you, Chantel. That's our brilliant educational specialist, Governor General Award winner. I am so overjoyed at this point. In January, when we convened our meeting, Carolyn alluded to earlier that we had a huge meeting that was convened back in 2013 with the late John Conyers being our facilitator. He was actually checking people in. He was making sure everybody signed their name, and we had contact information for them. At this point, we were gifted with a new benefactor, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, both introduced an House resolution in October 2021 that elevated our work to national status. And again, we did get a letter of support from the Consul General of Canada, Joe Comartin, who actually joined in from the Canadian side. This Detroit River Project, we have a coalition of about 45 organizations from the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, many of the municipalities along that 32-mile stretch, as well as organizations. The Essex County Black Historical Research Society, of course, has been a partner of ours for quite a while, probably because I'm the vice president of the group, but nonetheless, it is driven. We have the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, as well as the University of Windsor as partners, and many smaller organizations, the Community Foundation for Southeastern Michigan, the Downtown Detroit Partnership on the American side, quite a few of the organizations on the Canadian side, the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, as well as we are working with hopefully Museum Windsor on a larger scale. This is a product of love that have been passionate about for about 15 years now. And we have gone from doing about the speed limit, about 20, 25, and we're now doing 75 and stepping on the gas. So I urge everyone that's interested to go to DetroitRiverProject.com. And if you have questions you can't get answered here, send me a question, we will answer. And of course, there is that donation button because we are in the midst of fundraising, because this kind of initiative, driving World Heritage designation, is long-term. It does require funding. We're funding an educational project, camps, some more designation work. I'm trying to talk Carolyn into writing another volume. And so we are looking for a documentary. We have a couple of documentarians that are looking to do a project long view of the Detroit River Project, and how we're getting to World Heritage sites. So you need to keep your ears to the ground for that, because we're talking about 2 Emmy Award winning documentarians. So this isn't small time, this is pretty big time. But I am happy that everybody's enjoyed themselves today. And again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. Go to DetroitRiverProject.com. Give us a couple of dollars. We will appreciate it. I've got world-class historians that would love to be able to further their work a little bit further. So I thank you all for your participation, and thanks, Irene, for actually allowing us to share this with the group.
Thank you. Thank you, Chantel Browning-Morgan, Kimberly Simmons. Thank you to Carol Mull, Adrian Shad, Roy Finkenbein. Of course, thank you so much to Dr. Carolyn Smarts-Frost. I particularly would like to thank the University of Windsor Department of History and the University of Windsor Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and equity. And we are so grateful for everyone's partnership in this event. Thank you to Carly Kochenik and Willow Key for their contributions as student presenters. Are there any questions that we have not yet answered, audience members? All right. In that case, I'm going to ask just to, I'm going to encourage you to save a couple of dates. May 12th is the day when Marianne Shad Carey's sculpture at the University of Windsor will be unveiled in the morning. I think it's like either a 10:30 or 11 a.m. event. You can either watch that through the live stream or by invitation. Some of you may be there in person. I would also encourage you to check out the Buxton Homecoming, which is happening once again Labor Day weekend. That will be taking place in person this year. We're not yet entirely sure whether the history conference component will be virtual or in person, but all of the rest of the events will be happening in person for sure. So look for that Friday through Monday of the Labor Day weekend, and more details to come that way. If anyone has additional comments or questions or announcements they would like to share with our audience members today, please do include those in the chat and we'll look forward to reading them. I very much want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you who were present today. And thank you so much in absentia to Vita Tucker. We were very grateful to have Carolyn Smarts-Frost with us as the co-editor of this important work, A Fluid Frontier, Slavery Resistance and the Underground Railroad in the Detroit River Borderlands. But we are certainly sorry that Vita Smith-Tucker could not join us today, and we're very grateful for her work as well. And Adrian Shad, I want to say once again, it's lovely to finally be able to engage in an event related to this book with you. Everyone, enjoy your Saturday. Enjoy your weekend, stay safe, be well. This space will remain open for chat conversations to occur for the next 5 minutes, but that concludes our official symposium, and we thank all of you for being part of it. Take care.